Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Philadelphia. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. It began in the spring of 1893, when the city, still carrying the industrial hum of its factories and the soft decay of its older quarters, awoke to headlines about a doctor, an admired physician named Dr. Edwin Mallory. His name had appeared many times in the Philadelphia Inquirer for his charitable work and his unusual interest in the human mind. But this time, it appeared beneath a single chilling word: murder. According to the county docket, Dr. Mallory's practice was located near Walnut Street, where gaslight flickered across brick and cobblestone, and where his patients described him as quiet, compassionate, yet strangely distant. Some claimed his gaze could calm a hysterical woman or silence a convulsing patient. Others whispered that he practiced animal magnetism, the art known then as mesmerism, a theory that had fascinated medical men since the writings of Franz Mesmer in Europe decades earlier. The earliest accounts are conflicted. Some said Mallory's hypnotic techniques helped those suffering from chronic pain. Others hinted that certain female patients left his office pale and trembling, unable to recall what had happened behind the frosted door. By 1892, rumors of unorthodox experiments had reached the local medical board, but there was no official charge, only gossip and nervous laughter at supper tables. That changed on May 17th. At dawn, a patrolman named O'Rourke discovered a woman's body in a rented lodging 3 streets from Mallory's practice. Her name, as later confirmed by parish records, was Clara Denning, 28 years old, a seamstress, and a former patient of Dr. Mallory. There were no signs of struggle, only a mirror placed beside her bed and a pocket watch still ticking faintly on the floor. The coroner's report described a faint mark around her neck, consistent with restraint, though not strangulation. Witnesses noted that the doctor himself appeared at the police station before being summoned, stating simply, "I know why you've come." His calmness unsettled the constables. The city papers called it the Hypnosis case, while others whispered the Hypnosis killer. In those first few days, officials struggled to separate fact from hysteria. Some believed the case was proof that mesmerism could lead to moral ruin, that a man's will could enslave another's mind. Others suspected more ordinary motives: jealousy, infatuation, blackmail. But even then, certain testimonies from patients hinted at something far darker, a pattern that would not be fully understood until the trial began months later. And yet, among all the depositions, one note stood out in the district archives, written by a clerk named Samuel Crow. The doctor spoke gently, as though addressing himself. The trial of Dr. Edwin Mallory began in late October of 1893 inside the marble-pillared courtroom of Philadelphia's 5th District. The city's autumn air hung heavy with coal smoke, and every newspaper vendor seemed to shout his name. The gallery filled each morning with clerks, housewives, and curious students from the university hospital. Among them were several physicians, men who had once shared whiskey and debate with Mallory about the theories of mesmerism and its relation to the human nervous system. They now sat in silence, unwilling to meet his eyes. The presiding judge, Horace Latham, was known for his skepticism of what he called continental witch science. His tone was dry and clinical. The prosecution's first witness, Mrs. Agnes Cooper, testified that she had visited Mallory's office on several occasions for what he called nervous correction. Her words trembled. "He bade me look into his watch, sir, and when I did, I felt myself elsewheres. When I woke, the candle had burned low, and he told me not to speak of what I saw." The defense argued that such sessions were common among practitioners of animal magnetism, citing foreign journals and the writings of doctors in Paris and London. The name Mesmer surfaced repeatedly, as did discussions of somnambulic trances. In one tense exchange, a medical expert mentioned that the city's own Pennsylvania hospital once allowed experiments in mesmerism for pain relief during surgery, a reminder that science and superstition often shared the same hallways. Midway through the week, new evidence emerged. A leather notebook found in the doctor's home, half burned in the fireplace. Its pages contained lists of patients and cryptic entries such as "session prolonged," "memory suspended," and "the subject repeats dreams of another's voice." One line, circled twice in black ink, read simply, "CD responded fully." The initials matched Clara Denning's. When read aloud in court, a murmur rippled through the audience like wind in a church crypt. Dr. Mallory, calm as ever, denied wrongdoing. His voice was low, precise. "I sought to heal, not to harm. There are diseases unseen by the eye, gentlemen, and I have merely peered into that abyss." Reporters wrote that even the stenographer hesitated as he spoke, as if afraid of writing something that might later curse the page. Outside the courthouse, street preachers shouted warnings about devilry. Inside, doctors argued over whether mesmerism could erase memory or implant suggestion. The name of Franz Mesmer was invoked again as a cautionary echo, his once celebrated theories now appearing darker under the courtroom gaslights. By the second week, the press had transformed the case into a kind of Gothic theater. The courtroom sketches showed Mallory framed by shadow, his eyes drawn like hollow wells. Some described him as a visionary ahead of his time, others as a manipulator whose experiments crossed the threshold of sanity. But what none could explain was why, on the morning of the verdict's first session, several jurors reported the same dream, an image of a pocket watch swinging. The records of that morning, preserved in brittle courthouse transcripts, note an unusual stillness before proceedings began. One bailiff later recalled that even the judge's gavel seemed to echo longer than it should have, as if the air itself was holding its breath. The jury entered pale and quiet, and several jurors were observed rubbing their temples. When asked, they claimed to have slept poorly, plagued by similar dreams of clocks, whispers, and an unseen voice calling them to remember nothing. The prosecution moved swiftly, bringing forward a medical attendant from the city morgue named Joseph Fenwick. His testimony was plain but unnerving. He described examining Clara Denning's remains by lamplight, noting the absence of struggle, yet the presence of a faint bruise upon the temples, as though fingertips had rested there too long. When pressed, Fenwick added, "Her eyes were open, sir, wide as if she had seen something that never left her." The courtroom rustled with discomfort. In those years, such poetic testimony was frowned upon, but none could deny the imagery lingered. The defense attempted to dismantle these impressions by emphasizing the scientific respectability of mesmerism. They cited the experiments conducted in Europe decades earlier, particularly the work of Franz Mesmer, whose theory of animal magnetism claimed that invisible forces pass between bodies. Dr. Mallory, they argued, was a man of medicine following that intellectual lineage. "He is no sorcerer," said his counsel, "but a physician whose methods outpace the comprehension of his peers." Yet, the matter of the watch remained. It was presented in court, the same silver piece found near the victim's bed. The coroner had noted it continued to tick, even when its mainspring should have wound down. When the clerk placed it on the evidence table, several present swore they heard it beating lows, louder than expected. A journalist from the Evening Bulletin wrote that the sound commanded the room. Later, however, that line was struck from the official article. No one could recall who ordered its removal. As the case unfolded, a curious detail emerged from city directories. Dr. Mallory had once shared a building with another practitioner, Dr. Lewis Pritchard, who had abruptly moved west 2 years prior. The two had apparently conducted joint sessions in therapeutic suggestion and dream induction. Pritchard could not be located. Some believed he had fled upon hearing of the investigation. Others claimed he was seen in St. Louis offering private demonstrations under an assumed name. The newspapers began to weave their own version of events, a tale of partnership turned rivalry, of one man's descent into obsession with the human mind. Witnesses recalled hearing strange noises from the doctor's rooms at night, like murmuring voices overlapping, or a rhythmic tapping that continued for hours. One janitor, sworn in later, said he had once peeked through the keyhole and seen Mallory sitting in darkness, staring at his own reflection in a mirror, lips moving, though no sound emerged. When asked what words he thought he saw, by the end of that week, the courtroom had transformed into a theater of whispered superstition. Every session drew crowds that overflowed into the hallway, some coming not for justice, but to glimpse the doctor who spoke with eyes. Vendors outside sold cheap pamphlets labeled "The Hypnosis Killer of Philadelphia," printed overnight by local presses hungry for sensation. Inside, however, the atmosphere was far colder, more clinical, attention held together by the tick of that silver watch, always kept on the evidence table like a heartbeat that refused to die. The prosecution's next witness was a young apprentice nurse named Lydia Brown, formerly employed in Mallory's practice. Her testimony was halting, voice trembling as she recounted the night she left his service. The doctor had grown different, she said. He stopped speaking during sessions. He would simply stare, and his hands would tremble slightly, as if some invisible current passed through him. Once I saw him whisper to the mirror before the patient entered. She glanced toward the defendant then, her eyes wet. He said the mirror remembers what people forget. Her statement drew uneasy murmurs. The presiding judge called for order. The defense dismissed her account as the hysteria of an untrained girl exposed to medical procedure beyond her understanding. Yet even the jurors seemed unsettled. A later clerk's note in the archives describes how one juror crossed himself after her words, muttering that the mirror business was devil's work. Documents from that day show the defense's growing desperation. They called expert witnesses to legitimize Mallory's methods, quoting physicians from Paris who once demonstrated mesmerism before royal courts. Again, the name of Mesmer appeared, this time as both shield and curse. The defense insisted that Dr. Mallory's techniques were derived from those same scientific experiments, but the prosecutor countered sharply, "If this is science, then it is a science that leaves corpses and empty memories." It was during this exchange that a strange incident occurred. According to later affidavits, the courtroom lights dimmed unexpectedly. One of the gas jets sputtered, then steadied. In that brief darkness, a sound was heard, soft, rhythmic, metallic. When light returned, the silver watch on the table was found open, its hands spinning slowly backward. No one would claim responsibility. The judge demanded calm, yet the restlessness grew. A witness swore he saw Dr. Mallory smile faintly, though others said he only exhaled and lowered his gaze. That night, police stationed outside the courthouse reported seeing a man loitering by the gates, a tall figure in a dark overcoat and hat, face obscured. When approached, the man vanished into the fog along Chestnut Street. The guard noted his gait resembled the doctor's, but slower, as though walking in a trance. The following morning, the Enquirer printed a single cryptic line buried within its coverage. Some say the trial is haunted by what science dares not name. Most dismissed it as journalism's flourish. Yet though the following sessions dragged deep into November, and the city's tone shifted from fascination to dread, citizens began to speak of the Walnut Street Shadow, a figure rumored to appear outside Mallory's shuttered office at odd hours. Clerks passing by after dusk claimed to hear a faint ticking sound echoing from within, though the building had been sealed by police. Even among officials, there was a growing unease, as if the investigation itself had crossed some invisible boundary that reason could no longer follow. The prosecution introduced new evidence recovered from Mallory's rented rooms. 3 candle stubs arranged in a perfect triangle upon the floor, and beneath them what appeared to be a half-finished sketch of the human brain marked with tiny symbols instead of letters. A medical examiner, Dr. Ellsworth, described it in testimony. Each mark corresponds to what we now call the temporal lobe, associated with memory. It is as though the man believed thought itself could be mapped like veins in marble. The drawing was labeled Map of Obedience. Mallory, when questioned, admitted ownership, but insisted it was an academic diagram. His expression never faltered, yet behind him, the court artist later noted, one of the jurors appeared to faint. The record states a recess was called, though the transcript does not explain why. During that brief pause, the silver watch was reportedly moved into the judge's chambers for safekeeping, an order quietly given without discussion. The name of Mesmer surfaced once again during expert testimony. A professor from the University of Pennsylvania reminded the court that Mesmer's theory of magnetic fluid and invisible influence had once captivated Europe but fell into disrepute when scientific scrutiny exposed its failures. Still, the professor added, the mind is a curious landscape, and such ideas rarely die entirely. I hide, waiting for men like Dr. Mallory to rediscover them. The defense seized upon this. Then my client, the attorney argued, is no murderer, but merely a student of a forgotten art. Yet the prosecutor countered with grim precision, laying out a timeline of visits and witnesses, 6 patients in 2 years who left his care with missing memory, 1 dead, 1 vanished, 2 relocated out of state, and all connected by the same treatment. The room fell silent as he laid the final page upon the table. A receipt for chloroform purchased under an alias 2 weeks before Clara Denning's death. A reporter from the Public Ledger described the moment. Even those who came to scoff now looked away. When the session adjourned, the courthouse emptied under cold rain. Witnesses wrote that Mallory's face pressed briefly against the barred window as he was escorted away, his eyes reflecting the lamplight outside. One policeman swore that his lips moved in rhythm to the falling rain, counting perhaps, or whispering a phrase none could hear. That same officer later resigned, citing unexplained disturbances in his home that began the night after his shift on the Mallory case. The watch was... By the time the next hearing opened, the courthouse itself seemed burdened with exhaustion. The ceiling lamps hissed faintly, casting long, uneven shadows over the benches. A chronicler from the Pennsylvania Gazette described the air as too still for so many breathing men. Few spoke as the clerk read the morning's proceedings. Dr. Mallory entered wearing the same black coat he had worn every day of the trial, and again that small watch lay on the evidence table, glinting under the gaslight like an unblinking eye. The morning began with testimony from Reverend Samuel Wilcox, the chaplain of the city hospital. He had known Mallory in earlier years and spoke with evident conflict. He was a man who believed knowledge was mercy, Wilcox said. He tended to the sick who could not pay, yet spoke often of the spirit and the mind as if they were mirrors of one another. I once told him there were lines man should not cross. He answered that the lines were imaginary. When asked about the victim, Clara Denning, the Reverend's tone faltered. She sought forgiveness, though for what she never said. She told me once she dreamt in another person's voice. The statement drew whispers. The court requested silence. Mallory sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the far wall, lips forming the faint shape of words unspoken. In the following days, testimony blurred into argument. Physicians debated hypnotic trance against fainting fits. Newspaper men argued over headlines. And still, in the city's poorer quarters, new rumors took root. That Clara Denning's younger sister had disappeared, that her reflection no longer appeared properly in glass, that the doctor's shadow was seen walking when he was in custody. Most of it was dismissed as hysteria, but the panic gave the trial a peculiar gravity. Crowds no longer jeered. They watched in wary silence. Midway through the week, an unusual piece of evidence surfaced. A letter addressed to Dr. Mallory, but never sent, found among his desk papers. It was written by a former colleague, Dr. Lewis Pritchard, the same man who had vanished west. Its brief, uneven script read, "The experiment succeeded, but the second subject did not awaken as expected. You must not attempt further without containment." The prosecution presented it as proof of a broader pattern. The defense objected vehemently, arguing the letter's authenticity was uncertain. Yet even the judge seemed shaken. "Containment," he repeated softly, as though testing the word. The court adjourned early that day. Rain began to fall again, steady and cold. Witnesses leaving the building reported seeing Mallory glance toward the windows before being led away, his reflection doubling in the glass like 2 men walking side by side. That evening, the city lamps flickered briefly, and the Gazette press room lost power for nearly an hour. When the machines restarted, several pages of type were found rearranged into gibberish, words no compositor admitted setting. The editor destroyed the plates by morning, but one proof sheet survived in the archive. The next phase of the trial marked a strange shift, from the legal to the almost metaphysical. Proceedings turned to Dr. Mallory's personal journals, recovered from a trunk in his rented quarters. Their bindings were cracked, the ink uneven as though written in poor light. The entries began with conventional medical notes, but drifted into something else. Experiments described as threshold sessions, phrases such as memory inversion and induced obedience through mirrored perception. The prosecution read selected excerpts aloud, though several pages were withheld for decorum. What was read was enough. One entry dated January 3, 1893 stated, "If the subject dreams while under watch influence, they are mine for the span of that dream. When they wake, they recall only what I permit. The body resists, but the mind, oh, the mind opens like glass warmed by flame." The clerk's hand trembled as he recorded it. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. The defense argued that the journal reflected academic theorizing, not confession. "A physician must write freely to explore possibilities," said the attorney. These were philosophical musings, not acts. Yet the words clung like fog. The jurors glanced uneasily toward Mallory, who sat expressionless, fingertips pressed lightly together as though measuring their own stillness. Amid these debates, the court recalled an earlier witness, Nurse Lydia Brown, for clarification. She confirmed that Mallory often spoke of dream induction and that he had requested her help in constructing a chamber of isolation described as a room without mirrors or clocks. He said time distracted the spirit, she testified. He believed memory could be removed like a splinter, if only the mind were quiet enough. The defense dismissed it as exaggeration, but the word removed repeated in the press that night, printed in larger type than anything. Jachamun. Meanwhile, beyond the courthouse, Philadelphia's nights grew restless. Clergymen preached against invisible sciences, warning their congregations to keep windows covered after dark. Several of Mallory's surviving patients petitioned to remain anonymous, fearing public ridicule, or something worse. One, writing under initials in a local pamphlet, claimed she had awoken one night years earlier to see her reflection blink twice before her eyes opened. The story was dismissed as hysteria, yet it spread quietly among readers like a chill. There was also renewed talk of Dr. Lewis Pritchard, the vanished partner. A telegram from St. Louis police arrived, confirming that a man matching his description had been found dead 2 weeks earlier in a rented room. The cause was listed as sudden cardiac failure. In his pockets were 2 items, a scrap of paper with the word containment scrawled upon it, and a small broken watch, its hands frozen at 12 minutes past 3. The timing unnerved the court, for that was the same hour, precisely noted by the night guard, when, on the evening of Clara Denning's death, a faint ticking had been heard from Mallory's shuttered office. Reporters revived their speculation, calling it a synchrony of the damned. Clerks in the courthouse grew reluctant to handle evidence without gloves. The judge himself ordered that all exhibits be locked each night, sealed by signature. When the courtroom lights dimmed that afternoon, some said the shadows lengthened faster than they should. And when proceedings adjourned, a juror claimed to hear soft whispering behind the paneled wall, though none were there. The case had begun to consume. As December settled over Philadelphia, the trial approached its close, though no one dared to call it an ending. The courthouse grew colder, and the stenographers began bringing small lamps to their tables. The windows rattled at odd moments, though the air outside was calm. By then, almost every household within a mile of Walnut Street had spoken the doctor's name. Parents warned their children not to stare too long into mirrors or the glint of pocket watches. The very idea of mesmerism had turned into a whispered superstition. The prosecution's final argument rested upon the journals and the letter from Dr. Pritchard, claiming they revealed a deliberate pattern of control and concealment. Their theory was chillingly straightforward, that Mallory's experiments had advanced from suggestion to domination, and that Clara Denning had died when his influence could no longer be undone. They cited Mesmer's own legacy, a reminder that the line between science and delusion had always been fragile. In the hands of a man without restraint, the prosecutor said, such a science ceases to heal and begins to command. The defense countered by invoking the same history. They argued that mesmerism, as practiced by Mesmer and his successors, had been discredited by true scientists, and that Mallory's work was misunderstood imitation, not mastery. There is no evidence, the defense insisted, that the mind can be ruled by another's will. The accused is a doctor, not a magician. But even as they spoke, the jury's eyes often drifted toward the watch, resting silently on the table. Though it had stopped ticking weeks before, several witnesses later claimed to hear it faintly resume whenever Mallory was nearby. One bailiff swore he saw the hands move just half a mark during cross-examination. No record acknowledges this officially, but his resignation letter survives, citing nervous affliction of the imagination. The final witnesses spoke not of crime, but of atmosphere. A local constable described the doctor's office as too quiet, with wallpaper that peeled in precise, symmetrical lines. A neighbor recalled that pigeons refused to roost on the roof after dark. These testimonies, though irrelevant to the law, deepened the trial's mood. Even the defense grew subdued. When Mallory took the stand for the last time, his words were spare. "I have never taken a life," he said. "I have only sought to understand the shadow between waking and sleep. The world fears what it cannot measure." His gaze drifted toward the gallery. "But I have seen the human mind unguarded, and it is vast." The courtroom fell into a hush so complete that the creak of benches sounded like thunder. The judge's gavel broke the silence, but his voice wavered. Proceedings adjourned at sunset. The night that followed would become part of Philadelphia's rumor for decades. The courthouse watchman, whose notes remain in city archives, wrote that he made his rounds shortly after midnight. He reported seeing a faint light under the door of the evidence room. When he entered, the light was gone, but the watch, once motionless, now ticked softly again, steady and slow. He left the building and never returned. His final entry: the next morning the courthouse opened to find the evidence room sealed and the key missing. The janitor discovered it hours later on the judge's desk, though no one recalled placing it there. When the box containing the watch was unlocked, it was empty. The clerk swore he had checked it the night before, and that the seal had not been broken. The police searched the room, even the floorboards, but found nothing. The disappearance was never officially recorded in the trial summary, only in the private notes of Judge Latham, which surfaced decades later among his family's papers. His entry read, "The object no longer present, yet the sound persists. I do not believe the ticking was ever in the watch." That day, the jury received its final instructions. Mallory sat motionless, his face pale but calm. One reporter wrote that his expression seemed as though he were listening to something we could not hear. The verdict deliberations lasted longer than expected, nearly 16 hours. During that time, a storm rolled in from the river, and rain lashed the courthouse windows. By midnight, the jurors returned. Their foreman's voice shook slightly as he spoke. "We find the defendant not guilty by reason of mental derangement." The chamber erupted in divided noise. Some gasped in relief, others cried out in disbelief. The doctor bowed his head, murmuring thanks he never completed. The judge, visibly shaken, adjourned court at once and ordered that Mallory be remanded to the state hospital for observation. The gavel fell, sharp as a shot, and so the case of the hypnosis killer closed in law, if not in memory. The asylum's records, obtained later by the press, describe his early days of confinement as quiet. Mallory refused visitors, ate little, and asked for mirrors to be removed from his quarters. Doctors noted that he often appeared to be listening inwardly, his pulse quick, but steady. One nurse reported hearing him whisper during sleep, "It isn't silence, it's remembering backwards." He was moved to solitary care within the month. After that, the reports grow thin. One orderly, years later, claimed he found the doctor standing at his window one winter evening, hands folded neatly before him, eyes reflecting faint light, though the sky was moonless. When asked what he saw, Mallory replied, "A second self, across the glass, waiting for my turn." The next morning, the window pane was cracked from corner to corner, though the weather had been still. By early 1895, the hospital logbooks ceased mentioning him. An unsigned notice in the Inquirer that spring recorded his death without ceremony, stating only that he had expired suddenly from exhaustion. No funeral was held, no body publicly viewed. A sealed carriage transported his remains to an unmarked plot outside the city. Yet weeks later, an article appeared in the Ledger, claiming a man resembling Mallory was seen walking near his old office on Walnut Street, coat buttoned, eyes fixed ahead, as if following invisible rhythm. The report was dismissed as hoax, but one detail troubled investigators. The official inquest into Dr. Mallory's death was brief, held behind closed doors at the hospital. No photographs were taken, and only a single physician, Dr. Merton Hale, signed the report. His notes, later retrieved from the state archives, described the corpse as peaceful in aspect, without visible decay, though it had been found several hours after apparent cessation of breath. One cryptic line stood out. The eyes retained an unusual gloss, reflecting light, though the chamber was dark. The attendants sealed the coffin immediately afterward, an action unusual for natural death, but left unexplained. Meanwhile, outside the institution, whispers spread faster than facts. The nurses spoke of nights when footsteps echoed down empty corridors, always stopping outside the doctor's former room. Others said the mirrors in that ward had been permanently covered with black cloth, though no official order confirmed it. The hospital superintendent called it foolish rumor, but visitors to the grounds described feeling watched from the upper windows long after the cell had been vacated. In early 1896, the estate of Dr. Mallory was auctioned quietly. Among the few items listed were surgical instruments, a set of medical volumes, and several notebooks that disappeared before sale. An auction clerk later testified he remembered a tall gentleman in gray gloves paying in cash for a locked wooden chest marked MP. The buyer's name was not recorded. The initials matched only one known associate, Dr. Lewis Pritchard, deceased 2 years earlier. The coincidence was never pursued. By 1897, the story of the hypnosis killer had hardened into urban folklore. Street corner pamphlets claimed that Mallory had transferred his consciousness through hypnotic trance. A few even claimed his experiments reached the edge of death itself, suggesting he might command remembrance beyond the grave. Ministers denounced the talk as blasphemy, but their sermons only made the legend grow stronger. In academic circles, however, a more restrained debate emerged. Scholars at the time revisited the works of Mesmer, studying whether suggestion could truly alter bodily states. The Journal of Psychological Medicine published a brief piece referencing the Mallory phenomenon, arguing it demonstrated the danger of confusing trance with control. Yet no one could explain the peculiar consistency of testimonies from the trial, the shared dreams, the reports of the watch, the identical sensations of being summoned. Dr. Hale himself, writing privately to a colleague, confessed, "If what I witnessed was madness, it was a madness contagious not by contact, but by attention." In the years that followed, the Mallory case faded into the folds of memory. His practice building on Walnut Street was abandoned, then sold, then burned in a small electrical fire that destroyed the upper floor. The police listed the cause as faulty wiring, though the building had never been wired at all. Among the debris, only one thing survived intact: a warped mirror, soot-streaked but unbroken. The firemen reported that it was warm to the touch even after the flames had died. It was moved to the city archives for safekeeping, placed in storage under a mislabeled inventory tag. Misk, Glassware, 1890s. No one has opened that crate since. But according to a clerk's note added in the 1920s, when the crate was last moved for cataloging, a faint ticking was heard from it. By the turn of the century, most Philadelphians had forgotten the Mallory affair, though his name remained a caution whispered in hospital corridors. Medical students called him the Mirror Doctor, and older physicians, when pressed, would wave a hand and mutter that He looked too far inward. Yet the story refused to die completely. In 1902, a professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Thomas Leland, reopened the file as part of his study on post-hypnotic suggestion. He obtained fragments of Mallory's journals and several trial transcripts. In his later writings, Leland admitted that one entry disturbed him profoundly. Thought is a pulse. Once started, it does not cease. It waits for an ear. Leland's research, though formally skeptical, revived public interest. Newspapers published retrospectives calling the Mallory case Philadelphia's Dark Inheritance. The Gazette ran an illustration of the doctor's missing watch, claiming it symbolized time stolen from another's mind. Within weeks, letters poured in from readers who swore their grandparents remembered the trial, that they had heard the watch tick in their dreams, or that mirrors in their homes briefly clouded over when the story was mentioned. The paper dismissed the letters as mass fancy, but it printed more of them. Circulation tripled. That same year, the city authorized limited demolition of the old hospital wing where Mallory had died. Workmen unearthed a section of wall with strange discoloration. 3 faint circles burned into the plaster, each the size of a candle base. They also found fragments of polished glass embedded in mortar, as if mirrors had been sealed inside the wall itself. The foreman ordered the material discarded, but one laborer kept a piece, small enough to fit in his palm. He later reported it made a faint sound when held to the ear, like breathing behind a door. Tth. Rumor reached Dr. Leland, who arranged to interview the man privately. His notes survive in the university's archive. Subject pale, trembling, insists that reflection in fragment moves slightly out of sequence. Object wrapped and placed in storage. Recommend no further contact. Leland ended his study abruptly and resigned from teaching the following spring. Within academic circles, the Mesmer connection reappeared. A visiting lecturer from Paris remarked that Mesmer's earliest followers had described animal magnetism as a chain of sympathy, linking mind to mind. Perhaps, he suggested to his students, Dr. Mallory's tragedy lies in taking that chain too literally. The comment drew nervous laughter, but a few who attended noted afterward that one of the mirrors in the lecture hall cracked without cause. A century later, the building that housed Mallory's original practice was demolished to make way for new offices. Yet workers again reported peculiar trouble, equipment that stopped in unison, lanterns that dimmed, and, recorded in one foreman's journal, a persistent ticking sound that seemed to travel with them from room to room until the last wall fell. When the dust cleared, the foreman found among the rubble a coin-sized gear, smooth and silver, unconnected to any known mechanism. He kept it briefly, then threw it into the Delaware River. 3 days later, the clock tower at Independence Hall. By 1905, Philadelphia's fascination with the case had transformed from fear to quiet folklore. Street vendors sold postcards of the old courthouse, and local guides included the Mallory Watch legend as a curiosity for tourists. Yet within the archives, the story still pulsed in hidden corners, files that refused to stay still, clerks who spoke of miscounted pages, and ink that bled when exposed to light. Archivists called it the restless drawer. The name stuck. In early 1906, a new city clerk, Andrew Rowe, was assigned to catalog historical trials for an exhibition on American jurisprudence. Among the crates marked 1890-1899, he found a mislabeled box, Maersk, Glassware, 1890s. Inside was the soot-darkened mirror retrieved after the fire. Its surface was uneven but intact. When Rowe lifted it, dust slid away like ash. He later wrote in a private memorandum that, for a second, the reflection seemed to hesitate, his face arriving a moment later than his motion. He told no one, but he marked the crate "Do Not Display" and stored it in the sub-basement. Over the following weeks, Rowe's colleagues noticed he spent longer hours alone after dark. The janitor reported hearing faint clicking from the basement even after the lights were out, as though a typewriter were being used with the ribbon removed. When Rowe finally took sick leave, His desk contained only a few index cards. One read, "The watch isn't gone. It's inside the glass now." He never returned to work. The incident was never formally tied to the Mallory file, but the exhibition opened without the expected Philadelphia entry. Visitors noticed the omission. Officials called it a clerical delay. Among scholars, however, interest revived. A German neurologist lecturing at the university compared the Mallory case to early studies of hypnotic trance, noting again the lineage of Mesmer and his theory of magnetic RA. Port. "Every age," he warned, "produces its own Mesmer, men who believe they have found the invisible thread between bodies." The remark drew uneasy applause. That winter, several members of the faculty reported similar disturbances. Papers moved, lanterns dimming when they discussed the case, and one night, a rhythmic knocking from the old physiology lab. The janitor, recalling the pattern, remarked it sounded like the slow turn of a clock. The next morning, a teaching mirror used for anatomy demonstrations was found shattered. No one admitted touching it. The Evening Bulletin ran a short article titled "Echo of the Hypnosis Killer," suggesting that the doctor's spirit lingered in the reflective surfaces he once trusted more than men. The editorial mocked it as superstition, but the line stirred unease across the city. Mirrors in public houses were briefly covered, and for weeks, some residents claimed that their wall clocks stopped at random intervals, each time resuming not where they had left off, but several seconds earlier. In the spring of 1907, the university sealed its collection of Mallory-related materials under the supervision of Dr. Leland's successor. The box was catalogued as Obedience Materials, Restricted Access. The curator's handwritten note survives. Should any researcher reopen these items, please ensure no mirrors are present in the study room. No one has requested them since, but late at night, guards making rounds through that archive still report hearing what they call the patient. By 1910, most official references to the Mallory affair had been quietly erased from the city's academic circles. Theories once discussed in journals were now dismissed as curiosities of an unscientific age. Yet every few years, another small disturbance would draw the case back into focus, a misfiled document appearing on the wrong desk, or a researcher reporting that an old page from the trial records smelled faintly of chloroform when handled. These details were too trivial to print, yet too consistent to ignore. In March of that year, a visiting historian named Dr. Arthur Winslow came to Philadelphia to study forgotten criminal proceedings. He was drawn to the rumor of the missing watch and the mirror sealed in the archives. Winslow was a careful man, not one for ghost tales. He obtained temporary permission to review the restricted box labeled Obedience Materials. His diary, later recovered from his estate, begins plainly. "Today I unsealed the Mallory papers. They are curiously warm to the touch." What followed grew stranger with each entry. He described diagrams drawn with unnerving precision, circles within circles, lines radiating from a central point marked only with the letter C. One note in Mallory's hand read, "When rhythm is perfect, thought obeys the pulse, not the will." Winslow at first interpreted this as metaphor, perhaps a reference to hypnosis. But in later entries, his handwriting faltered. He wrote of hearing the faint cadence of ticking while copying notes, though no clock was present. "The sound does not cease," he wrote. "It only hides beneath silence." After his third day in the archive, Winslow began complaining of headaches. The janitor on duty claimed the man left the building pale, his pupils dilated as though emerging from a dark theater. He did not return for a week. When he finally came back, he demanded that the box be resealed. The attendant noted a smear on the mirror's surface, as if a hand had pressed against it from inside. Winslow left the city that same evening. His last diary entry, dated April 2nd, reads, "There are two reflections now. One waits for mine to blink." He was found dead 3 days later in a boarding house in Baltimore, a broken pocket watch beside him. The coroner listed the cause as heart failure, though the mechanism of the watch had fused, melted as if exposed to intense heat. No fire was reported in the building. After the incident, the university quietly recalled all materials related to the case. The Gazette printed a small obituary noting Winslow's dedication to local history without naming the subject of his research. The archives were sealed once again, their contents moved to a deeper vault beneath the main library, this time under lock and double inventory. The mirror was rewrapped in heavy cloth and placed upright, facing the wall. But not all copies of Mallory's writings were destroyed. One set of microphotographs, made decades earlier for preservation, remained in private hands, kept by a retired archivist who later claimed to hear scratching from the negatives at night. His family burned them after his death. Still, rumors persisted that a few frames survived, hidden among unrelated collections. Researchers who looked for them reported uncanny mishaps, equipment failures, electric lights dimming, and once a shattered camera lens without apparent cause. The curator who recorded. By the time 1912 arrived, the Mallory affair had once again faded into obscurity, but not before leaving a residue that clung to those who had touched it. Among city officials, it became known as the patient file that rewrites itself. Archivists insisted pages were found reordered, cross-referenced with files from unrelated cases, sometimes even those that hadn't existed when the doctor lived. When this occurred, the clerk said they heard a faint double tap, as if a pen striking wood in steady rhythm. They joked nervously that it was Mallory signing in. That spring, the last surviving juror from the 1893 trial, a retired bookbinder named Elias Grant, was interviewed by a journalist compiling an article on famous Philadelphia trials. The interview was never printed, but the transcript survived in draft form. Grant, then 83, spoke in slow, deliberate phrases. "He didn't kill that girl the way they said," he told the reporter. "But he took something. You could feel it leave the room when he looked at you." When asked what he meant, Grant went silent for nearly a minute before adding, "I still dream his voice counts the seconds." Within a month of that interview, Grant was found dead in his sleep. His bedside clock had stopped at 3:12, the same minute noted years earlier on the broken watch from Dr. Pritchard's pocket. The journalist who recorded the conversation left Philadelphia soon after and never submitted the piece. His daughter later found the unfinished draft, each margin filled with pencil scratches forming small circles like clock faces. Around that same time, the city's museum curators began organizing a special exhibition on forgotten experiments of the 19th century. The director, unaware of the sealed archive, requested a few of Mallory's papers for display. The request was approved by mistake. When the crate arrived and was unwrapped, virile staff members complained of dizziness and static in the air. The senior curator, a woman named Margaret Leach, noted in her report that the mirror, though heavily dusted, seemed to shimmer faintly as though wet. Within days, she requested its removal from the exhibit, citing health and safety reasons. A week later, Leach collapsed during a staff meeting. She survived, but told colleagues she had seen someone standing behind her reflection just before losing consciousness. The museum canceled the exhibition, citing budget constraints, though internal memos show the real reason. A night watchman had refused to enter the hall, claiming that the ticking he heard near the display case matched his own heartbeat. The crate was returned to storage, accompanied by a new instruction label in red ink. Handle only during daylight. Do not allow reflection onto walls. The archivist who wrote it later admitted the phrasing wasn't official policy. It was just instinct. By now, even the skeptics within the university preferred not to speak of the matter. Dr. Leland's successor gave a quiet interview to the Gazette, in which he dismissed the story as an unfortunate chain of coincidences exaggerated by frightened clerks. Yet when asked if the mirror still existed, he hesitated, then said only, "Everything in that box exists exactly as it wishes to." From that moment, the Mallory file ceased to appear in public inventories. But among night guards and custodians, the story remained alive. If you walk past the sealed vault on a still evening, you can hear the faintest ticking from inside. Not mechanical. The years that followed blurred the Mallory legend into something half-believed, half-denied. By 1915, a new generation of doctors filled Philadelphia's hospitals, trained in modern psychology and dismissive of anything not quantifiable. yet every so often an intern on night duty would mention a patient murmuring in trance, repeating words they could not have known. Count the breath, forget the light. When pressed, the patients claimed no memory afterward. Some even laughed it off, but others cried, insisting they had dreamt of a man standing behind glass, whispering their names. The chief medical officers forbade discussion of these contagious suggestions, as they called them. But in private correspondence, several physicians acknowledged that something in the wards felt wrong at night, the air pressing heavy, the clocks losing seconds and then regaining them. One senior nurse, recalling the old trial, kept her pocket watch covered with cloth during shifts. Not for fear, she wrote, but for respect. In 1916, the archives suffered a basement flood after an early thaw. Several crates were damaged, including the box labeled Obedience Materials. When the water receded, workers reported finding the mirror upright on its own, though the crate had been overturned. It bore no cracks, yet its surface had changed, darker, as if silvered anew. The custodian who handled it, a man named Horace Key, later told his wife that he saw letters swimming beneath the glass like ink under water. He died in his sleep 2 nights later, of what the coroner called heart shock. The mirror was dried and resealed by order of the city archivist, who refused to discuss it further. That same month, the Philadelphia Historical Society held a closed meeting to determine the fate of all Mallory materials. The minutes from that meeting are brief. Resolved, materials not to be displayed, cited, or circulated, all inquiry discouraged. Yet on the last page, in a different hand, someone had written, "Obedience cannot be buried, it listens." No one ever determined who added the line. In the same year, a young historian from Boston, Caroline Dorset, came to the city researching female figures in forgotten criminal cases. She requested access to the Mallory papers, but was denied. She persisted, writing letters to the society quoting legal right to public record. In her diary, discovered later, she wrote of visiting Walnut Street, standing where the old office had once been. "There is no building now," she wrote, "only the outline in the bricks of where doors used to be. I thought I heard tapping under my feet." Her letters stopped in July. Months later, her family received a small parcel postmarked from Philadelphia. Inside was her locket and a strip of photographic film showing what appeared to be a faint reflection in an empty window. The negative was analyzed by the Boston Evening Transcript, which concluded that the image contained no human subject but a distortion caused by uneven development. Yet those who viewed it described the impression of a face, half in shadow, half caught in mid-speech. That same week, the Historical Society's night watchman resigned after claiming he heard the same voice the papers mention, counting softly beyond the locked vault door. His replacement refused to walk that corridor alone. By the decade's end, the mirror was listed as missing due to damage. Officially, it no longer existed. Unofficially, guards reported that the sound of ticking never left the basement, and so the city adapted to its silence, choosing to forget what could not be explained, just as it had done. By 1918, the war in Europe had shifted the city's attention to matters far from its haunted histories. Trains rattled with soldiers, and black crepe hung on many doors. Yet in that same year, a letter surfaced in the correspondence of the Pennsylvania Medical Board, unsigned, written in a fine, archaic hand. It referenced experiments of obedience conducted upon the willing mind, and asked whether the instruments of the Walnut Street practitioner had been preserved. The letter's tone was polite, almost deferential, as if written to a fellow researcher rather than an authority. The board filed it under miscellaneous inquiry and forgot it. The envelope bore no return address, but the postmark read Baltimore, the city where Dr. Winslow had died a decade earlier. The influenza outbreak arrived soon after, and the archives once again flooded, not with water, but with the dead. The sub-basement holding the Mallory materials was sealed, its air judged unsafe for workers. For months, no one descended those steps. When the building reopened in 1919, a single crate was found misplaced, set upright against a wall though the floor bore no drag marks. The new archivist, weary of rumor, ordered the vault sealed permanently and the key destroyed. After the war, Philadelphia remade itself. New towers rose where soot once lingered, and the Mallory case faded into anecdote, a local myth folded into the city's layered memory. Yet for those who worked the night shift, the guards, cleaners, and railway men, the old whisper persisted. They spoke of a presence that seemed to travel along reflections, seen briefly in puddles, in the dark glass of office doors, in the shimmer of train windows at dusk. "He walks the mirrored line," one porter said, "never on our side, but near enough to see his breath." In 1920, a small exhibition opened at the Franklin Institute called The Mind and Mechanism. Among the items displayed was a collection of antique medical tools labeled Unknown Origin, Philadelphia, C1 1890. Among them sat a cracked magnifying lens set in brass. A journalist from the Bulletin later described it as ordinary save for its sound, a faint mechanical rhythm heard when held close to the ear. When asked about it, the curator replied that no such noise existed. The journalist insisted, but the quote was omitted from the printed piece. Months later, the same curator vanished. His office remained undisturbed, his coat still on its peg, his notes arranged neatly on the desk. The only irregularity was the mirror on the far wall, turned to face inward toward the plaster, as if it had been deliberately positioned that way. By then, even skeptics began to sense that Mallory's story was not about guilt or innocence, but endurance, the lingering pulse of an experiment that refused conclusion. One scholar who reviewed the remaining papers wrote, "If consciousness is rhythm, perhaps his has simply refused to cease." The university suppressed the remark, citing superstition, but copies circulated privately among students. Some joke that saying his name in front of a mirror would make your reflection blink twice, out of time. And so the myth shifted form again, carried not by newspapers or juries but by whispers, each retelling, trimming facts, adding shadows. To the city's youth, Mallory became less a man than a pattern, an idea that time and attention might itself obey him. And yet the old courthouse still stood, its upper floors condemned, its foundation sinking into damp soil. On still nights, when the river fog pressed low and the street lamps flickered, those passing swore they could hear it again, the soft, uncertain rhythm of... By 1923, the old courthouse on 5th Street had been scheduled for demolition. The city claimed the structure was unstable, though the engineer's report mentioned no danger greater than age. The workers sent to clear it were mostly veterans, men hardened by the war, yet several refused the job after the first week. They complained that the building breathed, that the walls held an echo too constant to be wind. The foreman, trying to keep morale, laughed and ordered the removal of debris from the basement first. That decision, in time, was regretted. Among the stored boxes and waterlogged files, they found what appeared to be a crate of glass and plaster. The label had faded almost completely, but one word could still be made out beneath layers of dust: obedience. When the lid was pried open, a single mirror leaned within, its cloth covering stiff and crumbling with age. The moment the light touched its surface, one worker, a man named Paul Danner, stumbled backward and dropped his lantern. He swore later that he saw someone behind him in the glass, a figure in a doctor's coat, standing where I stood, but smiling. The lantern shattered, sparks flew, and a brief fire licked the edge of the crate. By the time the others doused it, the mirror was gone, neither burned nor broken, simply absent. The demolition halted for a week while investigators catalogued the find. Nothing of value was recorded. The official report lists only miscellaneous debris, non-hazardous. Yet Danner quit the next day, leaving his wages uncollected. In a tavern that evening, he told a friend he heard the sound of ticking in his own breath. His wife confirmed he refused to sleep near windows thereafter. When the courthouse finally fell, its rubble carried to the Delaware for dumping, city officials noted one last anomaly. The workmen's clock stopped simultaneously at 3:12 p.m. Only later, when, An old reporter revisited the Mallory story. Did anyone recall that number? The article was printed quietly in the Evening Ledger under the title Echo of the Watchmaker, but it was pulled after one day, the editor claiming reader complaints. No one ever confirmed what those complaints were. In 1925, construction began on a new building over the same foundation, a records office, ironically. Workers reported odd electrical interference, though no power cables yet ran to the site. Foreman dismissed it as atmospheric discharge from the river fog. But when the basement was sealed and concrete poured, one laborer claimed to hear a muffled voice beneath the wet mix counting softly upward, never repeating a number. By 1927, the story was almost forgotten again. The veterans who had worked the demolition scattered, some moving west, others simply vanishing from payrolls. Their absence went unnoticed until years later, when a journalist tracking pension irregularities found that several had died of what doctors called heart seizure during sleep. Each was discovered with a stopped watch nearby, always at 3:12. The city moved on, as cities do. The archives modernized, the last of the paper files replaced by typed records. But in that new building on the old courthouse lot, the night clerks occasionally reported a different kind of malfunction. Typewriters whose keys depressed themselves in perfect rhythm, producing only ellipses across the page. When cleaned and tested, the machines worked flawlessly by day. One clerk, leaving the office after midnight, wrote in his log before locking up, "I think it's him." By the early 1930s, the last of the Mallory witnesses had passed, their names erased from memory as Philadelphia rebuilt itself in glass and steel. The old courthouse was gone, and in its place stood the records office, its facade plain and bureaucratic. Few who worked there knew, or cared, what soil they stood upon. Yet every few years, an incident would remind the city that some stories refuse the courtesy of ending. One such report came from a night custodian named William Tate. In 1931, he filed a complaint with his supervisor stating that a man in a black coat had been seen walking the lower corridor after hours. When guards investigated, they found no one, yet Tate insisted the figure had passed directly behind him, visible only in the reflection of the hallway glass. He described the face as too calm to be human. His employment record ends abruptly 3 days later with the notation "resigned without notice." The records office itself began to suffer small failures. Time clocks resetting, inkwells drying overnight, documents appearing 1 page short. Clerks joked that the doctor is editing. The joke stopped after a young typist fainted while working near the basement filing vault. She claimed she had heard a watch ticking right next to her ear, though no clock existed in that room. Her typewriter was found with the final line half-formed, "He remembers us." Supervisors dismissed it as exhaustion, yet the maintenance logs grew stranger. One electrician recorded power fluctuations that occurred at exact hourly intervals, always separated by 58 minutes and 48 seconds, an oddly precise rhythm that no machine in the building followed. He disconnected every clock, every line, but the pulse continued. "It's like the building has a heartbeat," he wrote. By 1935, the rumor had spread to the university once more. A historian researching early hypnosis cited Mallory's name in a lecture mentioning Mesmer's influence on his experiments. The lights flickered. The recording device, newly installed phonograph equipment, captured a faint metronomic sound not heard during the lecture itself. Technicians dismissed it as static, but those who listened closely swore they heard breathing between the clicks. And then, as if in obedience to its own rhythm, the story vanished again. The files were sealed, the building repurposed. The war years came and went, yet every so often a night guard or janitor would mention the same unease, that the mirrors in the records office showed the wrong hour, or that reflections seemed to move a heartbeat behind the living. Some said if you lingered too long near the basement, you might hear the faint counting, slow, patient, waiting for you to lose track of your own pulse. The city changed, the river widened, the archives filled with new names, but there are still those who claim that if you walk along Walnut Street after midnight, when fog pools low and the street lamps dim, you can hear it again, the steady, deliberate ticking of a pocket watch no one carries, marking not time, but attention. They say the sound grows louder near the site of the old courthouse. And though no map marks the place anymore, the ground itself remembers. If you stand long